No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to Maxim researcher Thomas Scrimgeour about his recent column. Thomas, welcome along to the podcast, mate. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we are talking about your recent column for Maxim, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Such an ominous title. I love it. It's great. And in this, you talk about how Britain is going to the polls along with like 75% of the democratic world this year. And you paint a fairly grim picture for the incumbent government. Do you want to just give us some context around that, why that might be grim and why they may not be one of the big parties after the election?
Yeah, for sure. Before I get to the substance of the political issues, I have to talk about how the election was called.
Yeah.
So Prime Minister Rishi Sunak comes out in front of number 10 Downing Street,
Yes.
and it's raining, and he's standing alone, and he announces an election. No one is standing beside him. He's getting soaked, and you can just hear in the background this Labour anthem playing. And it
So
kind
he
of
doesn't even have an umbrella or anything?
Doesn't have an umbrella, doesn't have anyone supporting him. And it just became immediately kind of the defining image of the election campaign.
Yeah.
So the polls are really poor for the Conservative Party, the Tories. They've been in power for 14 years through a range of different prime ministers. And basically, it's fair to say the electorate is not looking to re-elect them. The polling is very, very ominous. Labour, under their new leader Sir Keir Starmer, are looking dominant. So it's going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah. Well, New Zealand, the longest government we've had is like 8-9 years, something like that. So like 3 terms is usually a normal here. So 14 is...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in New Zealand, we keep governments for 6 years and then maybe we give them 3 more. Like that's sort of, in my lifetime, certainly it's been very reliable. You give them 6 and maybe you give them another one. But in the UK, it's a bit different, sort of over the last 110 years. I think it's somewhere in the mid-70 range of years. The Tory party have been in control. So they are sort of the default party of British politics. And they've stayed around for 14 years, but it's been sort of 5 different prime ministers. So there has been some change, but people I think are ready for something new.
Substantive change, maybe. And you talk about Labour, but also that's not the only danger that the Tories are facing in the UK. It's also, because they're supposed to be the Conservative, the right side of the political aisle, but there's danger from that side as well. They're kind of getting swallowed up from both sides.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I called the column Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, is that the Conservatives don't really have a good option. They can, if they pivot to the centre, they can take the fight to Labour, but they're actually, like you say, having to secure up their base from the right as well. So Nigel Farage was the big name in Brexit. So kind of 5-6 years ago now, Britain were debating whether or not they would leave the European Union, and Farage was one of the big voices there. He's sort of sceptical of immigration. He wants a sort of distinctly nationalist British kind of foreign policy. Now, he's just returned from America to the UK for the Reform Party, and they're polling it kind of okay. They're making some headlines, and so now the Conservatives have this dilemma. Are they going to shore up their right-wing bona fides, or are they going to go to the centre? And there are no good options.
And you draw a distinction between, well, kind of a connection between the dilemma that Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives are facing there in the UK with kind of where the government is at the moment here in New Zealand. Not a direct correlation, I guess, because we're not in election year. We just elected this government. They've just given us their first budget and they've got another 2.5 years. But you see the beginnings of that in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think what I see is a cautionary tale. The challenge the Conservative Party in the UK have is they don't have a story to tell about what they've done in Parliament. They've been in control for such a long time, and Rishi Sunak is talking about, oh, guys, we're bringing down inflation that rose up whilst they were in power.
Yeah.
They don't have the story about what they have done for Britain. And so with the National Party in New Zealand, they've just got into control in a kind of shared power agreement with 2 other parties, and they're now having to figure out what are they going to be as a government. And I think it's fair to say they probably haven't cast a strong vision for what kind of government they are. They haven't named what their plan is. And so the risk is that sometime in the future, it's unlikely to be a full 14 years, but sometime in the future, they will stand there, call an election, and not be able to point to what they have done.
So they need a bit of a story other than, I guess, the big campaign was get New Zealand back on track, like steady the ship, stop all this inflation, slow down, get crime under control, get all this stuff that had kind of run away from us, get it back under control. But that's not enough of a story, you don't think?
I don't think it's a story that can survive long term. I mean, you're right, their slogan was get New Zealand back on track, and you said steady the ship. I kind of think of a safe pair of hands campaign that we will kind of do things responsibly. And that's all well and good when times are uncertain. But suppose inflation comes down as it's sort of predicted to do, and New Zealand's in a couple of years' time, things are a bit more settled. Oh, we're steady probably isn't a story to tell. Now, this is New Zealand. It might get you elected for a second term. But if that's the only story, it's unlikely to get you a third term. And more importantly, the point of winning elections is to change things. It's to do things that you want to win in order to kind of impart a vision of the country, be able to write laws and do things. And so without a steady vision for what that is, it's hard to know where National will take the country.
And we've sort of talked around this column in the background about how National's positioned itself in this coalition as kind of the big brother keeping the other two coalition partners in place, but that's not really a position that you can maintain for a long time, is it?
Yeah, for sure. Now, the luxury of small parties is that they don't have to win over large numbers of people, just enough. So they can afford to be more divisive. And National, for the first time ever, has two coalition partners, parties who are fully in government with them. And so they've had to take on this big brother role where kind of we are the sensible managerial ones whenever the other two parties get a bit more radical. But the problem is that that risks them only being tarred with the negative sides of their coalition partners, and they don't have a clear positive vision to articulate as well. And so if they're going to the public and at the next election and say, vote for us, we're not like our coalition partners, well, then voters might as well swing all the way over to the other side if they're not convinced by the smaller parties. Who is National specifically, and what are they looking for?
So that's a difficult position to be in because there needs to be a steadying influence in the government. You can't just have the three parties fighting all the time. Someone has to be the manager, the big brother, the parent, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use. But how do you balance that with then doing your own thing instead of just trying to wrangle in these, Winston Peters got out of control, David Seymour's got out of control, we need to yank them back in. But we also need to provide a vision for who we are and who New Zealand, the kind of New Zealand we want to bring into existence. How could they do that?
Yeah, I think it is a real challenge. You've named some of the problems. And I also think it's not necessarily a natural mode to be in for Christopher Luxon, like that managerial language, his corporate background. He's really comfortable. And I don't think he's faking it or being superficial when he uses all his corporate speak. It's just the language he knows. So I think what National needs to do is actually just draw on some of the language they do have hovering around. They could talk about things like, localism or subsidiarity. They, could talk about sort of, communities and all of that stuff that they really do draw on. But they just keep defaulting to this managerial language, which doesn't inspire people, it doesn't grab people, and it also doesn't give them a clear sense of, well, what will you actually do other than manage better? It kind of, if all you have is the language of management, we don't know what you'll do next year because there'll be new challenges next year.
So maybe clearer communication, more vivid communication, less managerial speak.
Yeah, so some of that vivid communication, but obviously the electorate was perhaps a little bit sick of the really evocative language that Jacinda Ardern leaned really heavily into. But some of that is still important. And then also I think just a clear sense of destination of what do we actually believe New Zealand political and civil society should look like, other than government will run efficiently. Efficiently doing what? And what sorts of things is the government doing now it shouldn't be doing at all? What sorts of things is the government not doing that it should? Where are we heading other than carrying on business as usual, but slightly better?
So not just making the trains run on time, but getting them to a nice destination as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Thomas, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your column and some good thoughts there.
Thanks for having me. Britain is set to go to the polls. The result seems to have been a foregone conclusion ever since Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called the snap election. Standing alone, in the rain, with a Labour anthem blaring in the background. Christopher Luxon would do well to pay attention. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is likely to be the United Kingdom's next Prime Minister, ending 14 years of Tory rule. Starmer joined the Labour Party under the more radical Jeremy Corbyn and served in his shadow cabinet. Since becoming leader, however, he has steered the party more towards the centre, presenting himself as the moderate and reasonable face of British left-wing politics. The tactic is working. Labour's move to the centre puts the Tories in a double bind, because Labour isn't their only challenge. Nigel Farage, the champion of Brexit, has announced his return from America to lead Reform, a more hardline party on the British right. The wildly unpopular Conservatives are caught in between the devil and the deep blue sea. I shall leave it to the reader to decide which is which. Ultimately, nothing the Conservatives do will likely make a difference. They have been in power too long and overstayed their welcome. However, their campaign dilemma is instructive. Should they pivot to the centre and take the fight to Labour, or go further to the right and shore up their base against Farage and Reform? Simply put, are most voters in the middle and want a politician who fits in there? Or do they want a bold vision, regardless of what it is? Closer to home, the National Party is in the early stages of the same challenge, balancing cantankerous coalition partners and the demure New Zealand electorate. It's hard to articulate National's distinctive vision for New Zealand. The recent budget was an attempt to please everyone, and risks alienating everyone. The anti-tax crowd is mad, the tax cuts were smaller than promised. The fiscal responsibility hawks are unhappy that the deficits are larger than they were under Grant Robertson. The tax and spend left is fuming at any cuts to government services at all. National can only dream of holding on to power for 14 years. New Zealand has never been quite so reliably Tory as the UK. But should they manage an enduring reign, what would they actually want to achieve? Do they consider themselves moderates, or are they leading the country on a right-wing reformation? They can't take both roads. Christopher Luxon needs to cast a vision more comprehensive than back on track, and then bring the public along with him. The risk-averse temptation is to hold on to the small target strategy that won the election. But there will always be critics. Without a clear plan, the worry is that there won't be any fans. If they don't choose between the devil or the deep blue sea, they might have to fight both.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.